Yeah. I just wrote 10,000 words on that. Link is there. The digital crisis. Broadly speaking, if you own somebody 100,000, sorry, if you owe somebody $100,000 on a house, and the house is worth $200,000, a debt to equity swap would give them 50% ownership of the house, and it would give you zero debt. So you go from having 100% of a house worth $200,000 but owing 100 grand to owing zero, but now you're sharing the house with somebody else. That as an approach, if you go back to the 2008 crisis, rather than having enormous federal bailouts of the bank, which hugely destroyed the dollar and the American economy and everything else, if they had simply done debt to equity swaps, you would have wound up with, most of America had a third of their house owned by the bank, and if they sold that house at a future date, a third of that money would go to the bank, and the banks would have been sitting there with, equity that they had purchased with debt obligations, and everything would kind of cancel it out, and it would have dramatically reshaped society, but there was no infrastructure for handling the securitization of 100 million houses. There just wasn't a way of going through and making that equity tradable in any sensible way. The IT infrastructure at that point was so rotted out they couldn't even figure out who owned the mortgages for most of that debt, at least a lot of that debt. So that inability to keep track of the assets and the confusion about who owned what, blockchain emerges in a post-2008 environment as like, well, what if we had absolutely pristine record keeping? What if all of this was absolutely cut and dried and everybody could see everybody else's records? At that point, you get a system which is kind of self-certifying and therefore to some degree self-cleaning. Doing the same thing with real estate, so you had a national title registrar and that showed the equity in the properties and things like liens could be placed against it. There are jurisdictions that have that kind of capability in their property registers. America is somewhat on the back foot on that because all the property registers are at the county level. But if you went to, I don't even want to say this, but if you went to a federalization of the property registers, you might get into a position where you move your listing from the county office to the federal, and in the process of that, you also get to do the debt to equity swap. Because the American stuff is so broken down to the county level for real estate, it becomes quite difficult to imagine how you do that without breaking up centuries of tradition. But you sort of look at the situation and it's like, right now, the thing which is currently happening in Argentina, and the dollar is bailing out the Argentinian peso, right? They're buying pesos from Argentina. There's 20 billion on that transaction. There's nobody to bail out the dollar. So, unless very suddenly you get economic growth from nowhere, Elon Musk's predictions of like, oh my God, we're heading into some kind of massive doom spiral, we are in serious trouble here. I think there is a way out of that doesn't require rapid economic growth, but you have to think of this as being, you're not just unpicking 1971, where you kind of go off the gold standard, you're actually going, right the way back, and you're kind of unpicking the entire structure of the federal apparatus. You're unpicking 1913 because the dollar goes from being issued by the Federal Reserve to being an asset-backed currency backed by the real estate holdings. And that is a completely new paradigm for doing currency issuance in America. But it is not untested. That was how the Scottish banking system ran for centuries. They call it free banking. So a kind of federal level free banking, and free banking, by the way, it solves nearly all of the problems involved in fiat currency. Free banking revolution as an alternative to total dollar collapse, I think it's doable.